Johnstown is a small industrial town located in the Conemaugh Valley in the mountains of western Pennsylvania, 67 miles east of Pittsburgh. Its proximity to Pittsburgh led to Johnstown becoming a leader in the iron, steel, and coal industries. Johnstown's largest company was the Cambria Iron Works, founded in 1852. It was the most successful steel company at the time. Johnstown became an important transportation hub in the canal system because it is located where the Stony Creek River and Little Conemaugh River combine to form the Conemaugh River. The Conemaugh River drains into the Allegheny River just north of Pittsburgh. Johnstown would have been a little more than a footnote in the history of the steel industry if not for being the site of one of America's worst natural disasters. The spring of 1889 was uncharacteristically rainy. On May 30th, 1889, the storm of the century moved into the Johnstown area, pouring 6 to 10 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. Located in a narrow valley at the intersection of three rivers, Johnstown was prone to flooding. Most residents simply moved to the upper floors in their homes to wait for the flooding to subside. However, people did not realize that this would be no ordinary flooding. 14 miles up the Little Conemaugh River, Lake Conemaugh was rising. Lake Conemaugh was a 450-acre man-made lake owned by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The lake was held in place by the South Fork Dam. On the morning of May 31st, 1889, crews tried to fortify the failing dam, but soon they sent warnings to nearby communities that the dam may break. At 3:10 p.m., the South Fork Dam gave way, unleashing a 35 to 40-foot wave, containing 20 million tons of water. The wave rushed downhill towards Johnstown, destroying everything in its path. The Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge survived the impact of the wave, but trapped 45 acres of burning debris. When the floodwater subsided, the damage was obvious. The flood killed 2,209 people, including 99 complete families. Approximately 7% of Johnstown's 30,000 citizens were lost. The flood destroyed 1,600 homes and caused $17 million in property damage. Construction of the South Fork Dam in Western Reservoir started in 1840 as a feeder reservoir for the mainline canal that connected Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The dam was supposed to be completed in 1841, but a lack of funding, a cholera epidemic, and dam failures led to work stoppages. The reservoir was finally dammed on June 10, 1852. In 1854, the type of transportation changed to train. For this reason, the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal went out of business, making the dam obsolete. Over the next 20 years, ownership of the dam changed several times and maintenance was neglected. One owner removed the drainage pipes under the dam to sell them for scrap. This increased the sag in the top of the dam and meant there was no way to empty the reservoir for repairs. In 1879, Benjamin Ruff purchased the dam and the reservoir with the intent of developing a resort for the elite citizens of Pittsburgh. Ruff repaired the broken dam without the aid of an engineer and renamed the reservoir Lake Conemaugh. Ruff invited 61 of Pittsburgh's wealthiest men to join the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, including Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and Andrew Mellon. The exclusive club was meant to give the members and their families a break from the heat and dirt of Pittsburgh. Ruff made additional changes to the dam's original design. He lowered the dam 3 to 4 feet to accommodate a road to the club and installed fish screens across the spillway. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross arrived in Johnstown on June 5, 1889. As the founder and head of the American Red Cross, Barton believed that the Red Cross could play a role during peacetime by bringing relief during natural disasters. The Great Flood of 1889 was the first major disaster relief effort for the American Red Cross. After the flood, about 25,000 survivors needed to be fed, clothed, and cared for. The American Red Cross built Red Cross hotels to shelter Johnstown's homeless survivors. Barton and her organization stayed in Johnstown for nearly 5 months. Once the initial shock wore off and relief and recovery efforts were underway, attention began to turn to the question of who was responsible. The media and the general population placed the blame squarely on the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, yet legal efforts to gain compensation for the victims failed. At the time, fault liability dominated America's laws rather than strict liability. Fault liability means that a person has to act negligently or do something wrong in order to be held responsible for an accident. Strict liability does not have the requirement of wrongdoing. Before the Great Flood of 1889, a person had to act negligently in order to be held responsible for an accident. The club members' actions, even if they knew about the history of the problematic dam, did not amount to wrongdoing. In applying the fault doctrine, judges ruled that the excessive rainfall that led to the dam's failure amounted to an act of God. No individual or group was responsible. The Great Flood of 1889 was the most important factor in the shift of America's liability laws from fault to strict liability. In the United States, the disaster led to the widespread adoption of the English court decision, Fletcher v. Rylands. In 1860, Rylands created a reservoir to power his textile mill. The reservoir burst and flooded the neighboring coal mines of Fletcher. Rylands was found liable for Fletcher's damages. Proof of negligence was no longer required for non-natural or potentially mischievous use of land. In the United States, before the Great Flood of 1889, judges rejected Rylands, relying on fault liability or wrongdoing. Rejection of the Rylands decision usually occurred during times of economic depression. During such times, industry was allowed to grow unchecked in order to provide employment and prosperity. Rapid urbanization was encouraged with little regard to impact on residential populations. Courts stated that, in civilized societies, some individual rights had to be sacrificed for the common good. Dams, streets, factories, canals, and railroads were necessary for cities to flourish. Residents use and benefit from these improvements throughout their lives. If someone is harmed without obvious negligence involved, they had already received compensation because they received the benefits of those resources over the years. After the flood, the rise of labor activism and antitrust regulations led to limitations on industry. The destruction of the city was an obvious sign that greater protections were needed for their common citizens. The time was right for violence, or strict liability, to be accepted. Lake Conemaugh was not a necessary evil of industry. It was not there for the common good. It was there only for the pleasure of a wealthy few. If violence had been applied in this case, the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club would have been held liable, and the survivors of the flood would have received just compensation. Although economics, politics, and reform movements played a role, it was the dramatic, unforgettable scenes from the Great Flood that led to the adoption of Fletcher v. Rylands throughout the United States. It ushered in an era of strict liability and perhaps signaled the beginnings of our litigious society of today. The Great Flood of 1889 was a natural disaster that did not have to occur. It was true that the city of Johnstown was built on a floodplain and susceptible to occasional flooding, but a series of events over the course of 50 years led to the destruction of the city and loss of life. The owners and members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had the right to purchase the land and use it for their own pleasure. However, they also had the responsibility to maintain their lands and not use them in unnatural ways. Their actions infringed upon the residents of Johnstown rights to live and pursue happiness in their own way. The Great Flood of 1889 is the unnatural natural disaster that could have been avoided.